This episode, an interview with fantasy author Nat Russo.
There were some difficult moments as I was going through and trying to remember in detail a lot of the experiences that I had.
I'm Chris Well, and this is DIY Author. You're an author. Maybe you're taking the traditional route. Maybe you've chosen an independent path. Or maybe you want the best of both worlds. Wherever you want to go as a writer, DIY Author is here to help you on your journey with advice, encouragement, and practical tips. Because do it yourself doesn't have to mean do it alone. Hello, welcome to DIY Author. I'm your host, Chris Well. In this episode, we're talking with fantasy writer Nat Russo. We'll discuss his best-selling novel, Necromancer Awakening, how he writes, and his favorite tools as an author. Before we get to that interview, I want to remind you that DIY Author is now an app. You can now listen to and download episodes of this show through our new dedicated app. It's a free download from Apple, Amazon, or Google Play. Just go to your favorite app store and search for DIY Author. And now, our conversation with fantasy writer Nat Russo. And now I'm speaking with author Nat Russo. Welcome, Nat.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Chris.
You are the author of a brand new book as of this conversation. It is brand new, right? It's brand new?
It is.
And yet I still haven't said the name of it. The name of that book is Necromancer Awakening, and it is, quote, a dark fantasy bestseller. It came right out of the gate, and it's a bestseller on Amazon. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's done so much better than I had ever expected.
Well, great. So to start out, tell us about Necromancer Awakening.
Sure. It is a dark fantasy, like I mentioned. It's really a book about redemption. At its core, it's about what can happen when there are extreme abuses of religious authority on a global scale. That's really what it is at its core.
Now, when you say dark fantasy, does that mean that the point of view is dark, the worldview, or that it actually has certain content you would not find in a fantasy book?
It definitely has some dark content, and in fact, to the point at which you'll also find Necromancer on some of the horror bestseller lists as well. So there are some elements of horror. There's, issues dealing with it. The undead are very much a part of the story. So there are some elements of horror. There are some elements of gore. I tend to not shy away from depictions of violence, although it's I wouldn't consider it gratuitous. But of course, that's a judgment for the reader to make. But yeah, there are definitely some dark elements in there that you won't find in a typical fantasy. You're not going to find your typical fantasy races like dwarves and elves and ogres and that kind of thing.
Now, what inspired you to write this book?
About 25 years ago, I was a seminarian. I'm Catholic, and I was studying to be a priest at the time when I was about 19, 20 years old. So I was in the seminary for a few years. Unfortunately, I was exposed to a lot of abuses of religious authority. I'm not an anti-religious person by any stretch of the imagination. I still consider myself Catholic, but those experiences that I had really shaped who I am, and they shaped my writing as well. So, some of those experiences took many years for me to kind of fully digest internally, and eventually they came out in story form in Necromancer Awakening.
What did you learn about yourself from writing this book?
Well, that's an interesting thing, because I mentioned earlier that I'm not an anti-religious person by any stretch. The interesting thing was before I digested a lot of this in the form of writing a story, I thought I had a far more negative opinion about my religion than I actually do have. So what I found by writing my book is I kept going back to a type of balance where you have, in my book, you'll have two characters who are both authority figures in the world's religion in Arendor, the world in which this takes place. And I use one to demonstrate the negative side of things, and I use the other to demonstrate the good side of things. And going into the story, I wasn't expecting to portray that kind of balance, but it just kind of happened, and it wasn't really a conscious decision. It kind of came out. When I noticed it on subsequent drafts, I went back and highlighted it a little bit more because I liked the balance idea. So that was a bit of a learning experience for me.
How is this a novel only you could have written?
It very much stems from my training in the seminary. I was actually in two different seminaries, one with a religious order called the Legionaries of Christ. I speak about them in some detail on my blog, and they're kind of an interesting group of people. They've been in a lot of trouble with the church. A lot of stuff that they do has recently come to light, and so that's being dealt with. I was fortunate enough after leaving that seminary to enter a seminary that was run by the Benedictine monks at a seminary called St. Meinrad in southern Indiana. And through that experience, I was fortunate to be exposed to men that I consider to be extraordinarily holy. And I think that's where a lot of my balance comes from. And so a lot of my training in philosophy and the mysticism that I learned from the Benedictine monks really play into my story. And I don't think I could have written the Necromancer Awakening that's out there today without that training.
So, since the book has kind of these two sides, how much is that the two seminaries are represented here?
You know, it's strangely enough, I had never considered that until you just asked me that question. And on reflection, I think that's very much what's going on. I drew a lot of my negative experiences from my first period of time in the seminary, and all of my positive experiences from the second stay. So I think you're onto something there. I think it's definitely related.
Well, that is what I always say about writing. It's cheaper than therapy.
So true.
So what was the hardest thing about writing Necromancer Awakening?
You know, there were a lot of experiences that I had that I kind of tucked away. I kind of pushed down a little bit. You know, my instinct on dealing with a lot of problems is not to deal with them. It's to kind of, pretend they don't exist and hope for the best. When I was writing Necromancer Awakening, that was no longer possible. I had to pop the cork on some of those things and just finally, come to grips with them, to, shine a light on them and see what they meant and how I could portray them in a story format. So there were some difficult moments as I was going through and trying to remember in detail a lot of the experiences that I had.
In terms of what you're writing now, are you following up this story, or are you doing things that are completely different now?
I'm definitely following up. Necromancer Awakening is the first book of a trilogy, and I'm in the process of storyboarding book 2 right now, which is titled Necromancer Falling. But in the meantime, I also have a couple of shorter works of fiction that I'm developing. One is a short story, and the other is more of a novelette or novella. It's probably not large enough to be a novella, but not short enough to be a short story, that kind of thing. Both of them are set in the Necromancer universe, however, and some of the characters carry over from one story to the other. But the intent is that readers who haven't been exposed to Necromancer Awakening will not have to have read that in order to enjoy the short stories.
When did you first know that you wanted to be a writer?
I began writing when I was a teenager. It was just something that I was curious about because I had been, around the age of 12, I had started to become an avid reader, particularly in fantasy. And so I decided to just try my hand at it and share some stories with teachers and friends. But I never actually took it seriously until about 5 or 6 years ago. And that's when I really decided, okay, I really want to do this, but I don't know what I don't know yet. And so I decided to just throw myself into learning as much about the craft as I possibly could. Part of that involved actually starting the blog that I run. A lot of the articles that I write on the craft of writing are actually reminders to myself. So I can go back and revisit what I had learned when I was tackling certain problems and make sure that I don't make some of the same mistakes again. So I've been writing for, the better part of 25 years, but it wasn't until about 5 or 6 years ago that I actually took it seriously and said, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to write a book and I'm going to publish it.
What were the books or authors that you read as a kid?
I think the very first fantasy book that I read was Magician by Raymond E. Feist. I began reading that book and I just fell in love with it. And I wound up just going through the entire series, that Rift War saga, and I was just hooked on books at that point in time. Raymond Feist is a huge influence on me. At the time, I was also reading folks like Douglas Adams. I remember reading Robert Lynn Asprin. Frederick Pohl was another one. I read his Gateway book. I read it cover to cover in a single day, and I think that was the first time I had ever done that with a book. So those are some of the names. But I was consuming so many books that I've left out dozens, if not hundreds.
Who are the authors that you read now?
At the moment on my Kindle app, I'm reading the very first Dresden book by Jim Butcher. My friends have been telling me for years I need to read the Dresden books, and so I finally decided to just start that. And I have to say I love it. I'm having a grand old time with that. I've also been reading Brandon Sanderson, Patrick Rothfuss as well. So those are some of the more, I guess, current fantasy authors that I've been reading.
Okay, let's turn our attention to the tools that you use for writing.
Sure.
First of all, what are your favorite computers, e-readers, devices, and gadgets?
Okay. Well, I'm a techie. I'm a software engineer by trade, and I've been in the high tech related industry for more than 20 years now. So it's I love gadgets. I love any device you can hand me. If it's electronic, I want to play with it. As far as computers go, I haven't yet taken the step out into the Mac world. I intend to do that at some point in time. I'd like to have an interesting, balance of devices. Right now, I'm pretty much using PCs. I have an MSI laptop. It's actually a gaming laptop that I use for my writing that I just acquired a few months ago. Great laptop. As far as e-readers go, believe it or not, I haven't actually bought a Kindle yet. I intend to do that in the next month or two. Right now, I've been using the Kindle app for my iPad and iPhone, and that's been working pretty well. But
That's fair. That's fair.
I do intend to buy a Kindle Paperwhite, though. A colleague of mine has one of those, and I had an opportunity to play with that for a while, and it just looks fantastic. I'd love to get my hands on one of those. So I'm going to have to do that.
Okay, and then what are your favorite apps and software and those kinds of tools for writing? What do you use anything in particular?
Absolutely. I am a huge proponent of Scrivener. I've been using Scrivener now for almost 2 years, and it's the type of software that the only way I can describe it is it's a game changer. It was a game changer for me. It was one of those things where you get a hold of it, and you start, after you finally get accustomed to it, you start asking yourself, how did I ever do this without this tool? And so that's kind of what Scrivener became for me. So I absolutely love that for just general purpose writing, tracking. I use it for planning, storyboarding. I use it for the actual writing. I also use it to store canonical versions of my universe, for lack of better words. So I'll use it as almost like a local Wikipedia type of thing, where I can very quickly dig out certain informations about a culture that I wrote in book 1, but I don't, retain all of the details. So I want to go back and reference them to make sure I get everything right. So Scrivener works very well for that as well. As far as apps are concerned on my mobile devices, I keep it pretty simple with the apps. I use the Notes app pretty much to jot down random notes as they come to me, as ideas come to me while I'm walking or exercising or something. I'll use the Notes app. I also use a service called If This Then That. I think it's IFTTT, and that's an interesting web service where you can connect various services that you subscribe to. So the way I use it is I can send myself an email, and if it has a particular token in the subject of the email, the if this then that service will take a hold of it and it will append it to a document that I keep in Google Drive. So that's a quick way of sending ideas to myself, and I can, I have the comfort level to know that I'm not going to lose them. So that's been a great help. And other than that, I use Tweetbot to keep in touch with my social media for Twitter and stuff when I'm on the go.
Okay, wait. This if this then that.
Yep.
When you said it uploads to, so it doesn't upload a separate article to Google Drive. It adds it to an existing article?
That's correct. So that's kind of an interesting service, because what it does is it basically connects two or more endpoints, and the endpoints are defined as whatever services you currently subscribe to. It could be anything from email to Facebook to Pinterest to a host of other things, including any smart home apps that you might have and run mobily. And basically all it does is it sits out there on the web and it listens. You give it permission to access your various services, and it basically just sits out there and listens for an event. And you define these events through their web interface in a very intuitive, user-friendly manner. And so what it does for me is it monitors my Gmail account. And when it detects that I've sent myself an email with a very specific word in the subject, it will take the body, it will basically take the text of that message and append it to a document that already exists in Google Docs for me.
I love that.
It's awesome.
That's great.
And I can change the token. I can use that token that I mentioned in the subject to categorize the documents. So I can have multiple documents in Google Drive, and the token that if this then that detects will determine which document it gets appended to.
That's very cool. So what does your writing space look like?
Early on, I had just basically set up my laptop at my kitchen table. My home office has pretty much been taken over by my son. So all of his computer stuff's in there. He's a musician as well, so all of his instruments are in there. So, but lately I just kind of sit on my couch with my laptop, and I have this laptop board. It's almost like a cooling surface, and I sit on my couch with the laptop. And the thing that I like about it is that it doesn't isolate me from my family. My family can be in here watching television or doing whatever they're going to do, and I'm still part of the action. I'm sitting here writing, but I'm still very accessible and aware of what's going on around me. Now, I should say that was very difficult at first because I started off as the type of writer who needed absolute silence in order to be successful. But since then I've trained myself to be able to write in noisy environments so that I can just write wherever I am, wherever I have to be.
What part of being an author do you find the most difficult?
The most difficult thing for me is just finding the time to actually write. That's tricky for me because I don't yet earn any substantial amount of money from my writing. So I still have a day job that I have to go to, and there's, it's a professional job, so there's a lot of expectations about, a certain number of hours that you're going to work every week and, that kind of thing. It's a project-driven job that I work, so there are periods of time where for 2 and 3 months we're in crunch mode working 60 and 80-hour weeks. That's very difficult to find time to do that. And now that I actually have a published book, a lot of my free time is actually spent in business planning and marketing as well. So I'm hoping that it's still a learning process to me. I'm still trying to find that balance between running my writing business and actually writing. And that's proven to be a challenge so far.
What problem with writing was your greatest roadblock, and how did you overcome it?
I think the biggest roadblock that I had was I was under a misconception of basically how to write, if that makes any sense. So I'll explain a little bit. So in the beginning, I was basically thinking that I needed to just sit down at the keyboard with very little planning and just have at it, just start typing and see where the story took me. And inevitably, I would get to a point where I just didn't know where to go from there. I just didn't have a plan. And no matter how much rewriting I did, I never quite closed the circle. I never got to the end of a story. I think I came to realize that I needed an outline, really, to write my stories. And I didn't know this until I read a book by James Scott Bell called Plot and Structure. I was just kind of grasping for straws, seeing what it was I might be missing, and that happened to be the magic piece. I realized that all this time, I didn't really have a plot. I was just allowing these plots to evolve as they went on, and they kind of meandered and went nowhere. And so for me, I discovered that I need to plot some of this stuff up front. And so that was the biggest roadblock for me, was just coming to terms with the fact that for me, I was doing it incorrectly. For many other people, that works for them. That was just a technique that did not work for me. And so I had to learn to embrace a new technique.
So what are your writing habits? It sounds like you're talking about you were a make-it-up-as-you-go writer, and now you're becoming an outline writer.
That's correct. The interesting thing is that I'm kind of a hybrid. So all those years that I spent being a pantser, as they call them, just writing from the seat of my pants, actually plays into my current writing style. So at present, what I really need is I absolutely have to know how my story is going to end. And then beyond that, I need to know what some of the major plot pieces are. And they kind of act as a navigation device for me as I'm writing. So I always have something to steer towards, regardless of what part of the story that I'm in. But when it comes to the actual prose, when I sit down and I begin writing the story, it is actually done in an exploratory kind of way. I do kind of just go with the flow, but I have this safety net of knowing what I'm aiming for. So I can always steer things in the right direction. And that seems to work very well for me.
And then once you have a manuscript, what is your editing process like?
That's kind of interesting in that I approach my editing in the same way that I approach my software engineering. It's very methodical. Every revision that I make is done for a very specific purpose. So I do have a series of checklists that I use initially. So on the day that I finish my first draft, the very first thing that I do is I set it down and I try to forget about it for about 6 weeks. And I move on to other work. And I found that I absolutely have to do this in order to gain the necessary objectivity that I need and distance from the work to actually revise it. Otherwise, I'm still in this mode where I think every word that I wrote is sacrosanct and I can't change it. So I have to get that distance from it first. Once I do, about 6 weeks later, I have a couple of checklists that I use for basic tidying up, like, making sure that I'm not using certain words or phrases incorrectly. I have certain pet words and phrases that I tend to misuse, and I know this about myself, so I have a list of them, and I go back in revision and I look specifically for those to make sure that they're okay. And once I get through the checklist type of stuff, I then go on a series of revisions that are very targeted. Like, I'll take one pass for characterization, I'll take another pass for theme and symbolism, and so on, until I get to the end of those targeted revisions. Once I'm at that point, then I actually share it with beta readers, and I take feedback from them. That's getting close to the last step, so to speak. I try not to make any revision unless I have a specific reason that I can articulate for making it. And when I get to the point where I no longer have a reason for making changes, that's when I know I'm at the point where I'm done, and I can move on towards publishing.
What is the best thing you've done to promote your work?
I think the single largest contributing factor to any success that I've had so far was actually the work that I did prior to publishing. And that was the couple of years, 2 or 3 years that I spent building a writer's platform. And it's kind of a controversial subject. There's a lot of folks out there that say it's a waste of time, and I definitely see what they're getting at. If you're building a platform, if that time is spent at the expense of your writing time, then it is not being well spent, and you should reevaluate what you're doing. There's no doubt about that. On the other hand, having that platform, once it's built, it allows you to reach a lot of people in a very short period of time. And that's kind of what you need on the business end of things to drive your initial book sales and to get onto those bestseller lists. So the more time that you can spend up front before you publish building a following of people, the better off you'll be when you actually publish your book.
How involved were you in the design of Necromancer Awakening?
Intimately, from beginning to end. There are some key contributors that I mentioned in the acknowledgments, a couple of co-workers. One co-worker in particular, he's also an avid fantasy fan, and we would have, he's also a tabletop RPG player, which I am as well. And so he and I would have in-depth conversations about magic in the context of my story world. And that was very helpful in when I was wrestling with certain things. What should I include in my own magic system and what should I leave out? So that was very helpful. But in terms of the overall design, storyboarding, the actual storyboarding was a very solitary process for me. I just did that pretty much by myself. At the time, I was using PowerPoint for my storyboards. I would make a slide for each scene, and that would act as kind of a virtual note card. And that was very much a solitary exercise for me.
What's the best advice you've ever received?
The advice that changed everything for me was in that book I mentioned from James Scott Bell, Plot and Structure. There is something that he refers to as the big lie in capital letters. And this big lie that he says is being perpetrated on potential writers is the notion that you're either born a writer or you'll never be a writer, one of the other. He goes into painstaking detail to show and to prove that writing is actually a learned craft. There are certain things that we're definitely born with. Some of us definitely have more talent than others do. There's no denying that whatsoever, and that's a wonderful gift to have. We're all kind of born with some degree of imagination, and it's really a question of, do we nurture that imagination, or do we suppress it somehow, just by virtue of how we're brought up or our environment or what have you. But the single best advice that I got from him was that this is something that can be learned and it can be improved on. And it's true, unless you have a substantial amount of talent, you may not ever be what you would call a, quote, great writer, but you can certainly be a good, successful writer. And those two things aren't necessarily the same. And so that was a very interesting thing for me, because it took away the fear that I would never be great. Because for me at the time, it was very black and white. I would either be a great writer or I wouldn't be a writer at all. And James Scott Bell kind of taught me that, no, there's this kind of gray area in the middle that you really kind of have to pass through. And until you start trying to pass through it, you'll never really achieve your full potential. So that was kind of a mind-blowing piece of advice for me.
Well, thank you, Nat Russo, author of Necromancer Awakening. Your blog is A Writer's Journey, and it's on your website. Is this your primary website, erindorpress.com?
That's correct.
Okay, and then where else can people find you online? So
I'm also on Facebook. I have a Facebook page. It's facebook.com/NatRussoAuthor. My Twitter handle is @NatRusso.
Thank you very much, Nat.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us this episode. Be sure and catch every episode of DIY Author. We're available in iTunes and Stitcher, and of course we have our own dedicated app. Just go to your favorite app store and search for DIY Author. This is Chris Well saying thanks for listening. I hope you'll join me again. This has been DIY Author. Please visit us online at DIYauthor.com and be sure to sign up for our email newsletter. If you enjoyed this program, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. Until next time, keep writing. And remember, do it yourself doesn't have to mean do it alone.